It's such an honor to be here. I'm so glad that you all are up this Saturday morning and a part of this program. I'm excited to have the opportunity to share more about native pollinators and the world that they live in, which is also the world that we live in. In the bustling meadows, hidden forests, and vibrant gardens, there exists a world often overlooked, a world where tiny heroes silently shape the landscapes and sustain the tapestry of life as we know it. Today, we're going to peel back these layers of this enigmatic realm and shine a light on these often underappreciated champions of pollination, our native pollinators. All right, so as we talk about this, it's going to become very clear that these are not just incidental visitors. They are they're really the lifeblood of ecosystems. They're the silent architects of biodiversity, and they're the guardians of our food security. So let me introduce some of these to you. We have tireless bees. We have elegant butterflies, we have cryptic moths, we have unassuming flies, and we have industrious beetles. These are more than ecological functional organisms. All of these native pollinators help us have an interconnectedness to life. The framework for this presentation today is right here. We're going to talk about diversity and significance. We're going to talk about their role in biodiversity. We'll talk about their role in agriculture. There's also much that we don't know. So some of this mysterious behavior, we're going to delve into that. And then also the threats and then things that we can do to help. Mae Berenbaum is an entomologist, probably one of the most famous entomologists. If you haven't heard of her, that's okay. If you are an X-Files fan, there's actually a character in there named after her. But she says, there are few human activities, no matter how complex or simple, that don't relate to insects. Now, entomologists have kind of worked themselves out of a job because most of you probably don't think about insects every living moment of your life. However, if you really start thinking about it, they really are a part of our lives, and not in the icky way, so in beneficial ways. If we were to take all the species on Earth and put them into this pie chart, all the known species, and I think that I got most of the groups here, what stands out to you about this?
We don't matter. Yeah.
Yeah, the insects. So that we know about 1.5 million species of insects. That is a lot. However, it's estimated that I've heard estimates between 5 and 30 million. So we still have a lot to learn. And then also, I do just want to point out that the fungi, protozoa, algae, bacteria, we know very little about those. In fact, defining what a species is something we're still working on, especially for those areas. So when we finally learn all the different species of life, this chart will actually look very, very different. But one thing I want to point out is, where do we fit in on that as one species? And all the rest that's there. I also want to point out that with insects, most of them are beneficial. In fact, only it's less than 2% are even considered pests. So that means more than 98% are beneficial or neutral. All right, so what are those benefits of insects? Well, nutrient recycling, that comes in the form of breaking down wood. When a tree falls, termites are actually beneficial, not in our homes, but in the forest, very beneficial organisms. Animal waste services, so when they poo, what happens to that? It's insect activity that breaks down most of it. There's also fungi and bacterial activity, but also like when animals die in the wild, it's insect activity usually that's breaking it down and making it more readily available for those other organisms and then available for other plant growth. Of course, there's pollination services for plants that help create food for us, that help create food for other animals, and also for just propagating the plant species, which is what it's actually there for. Insects are very important for soil aeration. And as I mentioned, insects just themselves are very important as a food source for other animals. And also, insects serve as a fantastic inspiration for many technologies. So chart is back up here. I have this up here focusing on our pollinator species. So you can see that is a pretty big chunk of those insects that we know of that are pollinators. So who are the pollinators? I've shown you some of them, but really when we look at all of this, and this ties into that display in the back, I hope you guys do get a chance to go and look at it. But there are many different animals that are part of the pollination world. So we have bats, we have small mammals, we have some birds, we have moths and butterflies and bees and wasps and flies and beetles. So many different animals are part of that pollination. So drilling down a little bit, 75% of North American plant species actually require an insect, mostly bees, for pollination. When you think of a bee, my guess is you're thinking about a honeybee, right? Well, there are many different species of bees. The bees that we have here in North America is pretty much one species, but there's actually about 4,000 species here in the United States, about 20,000 worldwide. Here in Missouri, we have approximately 450 to 500 species of bees. Many of these are pollen specialists, meaning that they only collect pollen from a certain species or a genus or a certain close group of flowers. It's also important to think about flies as pollinators. They're our number 2 pollinator. Bet you didn't know that. For a lot of people, when they're thinking about pollinators, they're thinking of butterflies or they're thinking about hummingbirds, and those are important pollinators. But when we start looking at the numbers, we also see how important our bees and flies are. 750 species of butterflies, 11,000 species of moths in the United States. And then there are some plants that do require beetles for pollination. So let's talk about all of this information in the role of biodiversity. So first of all, what exactly is pollination? Pollination is the transfer of pollen from one flower to another flower, but it's actually more than that. It has to be flowers of the same species. So we can't just take flower or pollen from a daylily and put it on a rose and hope that things are going to work out. It has to be from one species to the other of the same species. And this is where it becomes very important when, from the plant's perspective, why bees are so important. So as I mentioned, pollinator-supported plant communities, many of our plants that are out there do require to have this pollination happen, and it can't just be any pollen, it has to be their pollen. Another factor that is good to remember from the plant's perspective is that the plants, it takes a lot of energy to produce these resources, to produce that to produce the pollen and the nectar. So it's a very energy intensive resource. And so for them, they would very much like I'm anthropomorphizing, sorry, but I'm going to do it anyway. They would very much like to have their efforts not be in vain. And so again, that's important when we start talking about bees. I mentioned that there are many animals that are also dependent on the food that's produced from these plants that is pollinator facilitated. Okay, so that helps with our biodiversity. There's so many animals that depend on the role of pollinators in nature. But what about agriculture? So I'm going to get more focused on us. So all the foods that are in this picture are actually dependent on pollinators. Bees are a huge part of that. Anything look good on there? Yeah, I think so too. I also want to point out all the different kinds of bees that are up there. While honeybees are important in agriculture, our native bees are very important. Here's something else to just drive the point home. Have any of you seen something kind of like this? Yeah, so if we go into the grocery store or farmer's market and we're looking at all the wonderful food, we've removed bees, and that's what we're left. Still, we have food, but this has all the good stuff, right? Okay. So why do I keep talking about bees? They are built for this. So look at how fuzzy they are. It's not just because it's cute. They didn't think about that when they were, evolving. But that fur is not fur, the hair is actually really important. So they're covered in it. And bees have this really cool feature. It's bifurcated. So at the ends, it's split. And that can create a static charge. So when they land on a flower, pollen can actually come to them and it can just stick on them. And then they also have combs on their legs that can actually comb that pollen into specialized pockets on their body. So either on their legs or on their abdomen, and they're able to actually carry that pollen back to wherever they are provisioning a nest. So for honeybees, they're bringing it back to their hive, but for most of our native bees, they're taking it to underground cavities, or they're putting it in pithy stems where they're going to be laying their eggs, so they're provisioning their nests. Just a couple more differences between honeybees and native bee species. That might be too small for you guys in the back. I apologize for that, but let's just talk about these. So most people, like I said, think about honeybees when I'm talking about bees. We have really one species that is used here in the United States, but there's 7 to 11 species depending on how you sort them out. But they are eusocial, which means that they live in a colony. They have different castes. So the queen and worker bees and overlapping generations. And we've actually been able to train them to be in these hives so we can have them in our backyard, or we can transport them across the country. It's actually quite convenient. They are also used a lot in research. Anytime you're looking at things that have research on bees, it's on our honeybees for the most part. So when they are pollinating, or when they're not thinking about it as pollinating, they're thinking of it, I need to get honey, or not honey, but get nectar or get pollen, they will usually really get into a flower. And that is contrasted by our native bees that will often quickly go from flower to flower. And then also, I think it's good to mention that our honeybees are in decline. They've had a lot of issues, and we'll talk more about some of those issues later. But I think it was not necessarily last year. I don't know what the statistic is from last year, but the year before, after the winter, we realized that we'd lost about 40% of our hives. Now, if you are a beekeeper, that's significant. If you were a cattle rancher and you lost 40% of your herd, that would be very significant. So it is an issue. Fortunately, we're able to help them overcome that each year, but it is something to consider. Native bee species, on the other hand, they don't produce honey, so they're not producing those resources that we're commonly thinking about. But we need to learn more about what it is that they're doing, because they are very important in the agriculture scheme. So most of them live in the ground. And then the rest of them typically are cavity nesters. And by that, I mean like they're living in those, or they're nesting in those pithy stems. So if it has a hollow stem, that's where most of them will create nests. It's really important to know that most of them are solitary. So whereas our honeybees are social and they all live together, most of our native bees are solitary, which means that after the egg is laid, they're not really interacting with another of their species until it's time to reproduce. Now, there's a whole spectrum. So we have some that are fully eusocial and some that are fully solitary, and then there's some that are in between. There's a huge diversity. I challenge you all to go home and go down that rabbit hole. So here's just an example of some of the bees here in Western and Eastern North America. Huge diversity in size, in habitat that they're in the way that they look. They're just really fascinating creatures. So almost all crops, it's interesting that native bees are actually major pollinators. Our bees are really important, and like we transport them for like the almond harvest and blueberry harvest and cranberry harvest. But our native bees are there already and doing a lot of the work too. Even with some crops that don't require pollinators, our bees actually are still very helpful. So like tomatoes, anybody grow tomatoes here? Okay, and peppers? Well, those are self-pollinating. They don't actually have to have a pollinator. But if you want to see something fun this summer, go out and watch some bumblebees come up to your tomato plants. And like I said, they can pollinate themselves, but having bumblebees come up, they do this really cool thing. They get up right into the flower, they hold it, and they shake it. It's like it's a pepper shaker. And what they're doing is it makes it so the pollen just falls out on them, but it also helps with pollination of the plant. So grapes, another example, they're wind pollinated, so they don't actually need bees. But if you're in a vineyard, you're going to find that there are cover crops between in the aisles in between. And it turns out that those actually do benefit also from our bees. There's many examples of where bees are helpful. Okay, mysterious behavior. Let's talk about that. Okay, so first of all, the mysterious part is, oh yeah, native bees are actually really important. And there's so many more of those, many more species than our honeybees. But let's talk about some of the things that really start mattering when we're looking at conservation efforts and just their life history. So phenology. Phenology is when we look at the timing of when things are coming into bloom and when the insects might match up with them. So native plants have been here, you know, they were here before we were. And the insects co-evolved with them. And we find that there are some plants that come into bloom at about the same time as when insects would be emerging to be able to help pollinate them. There's really this intricate dance between the two. It's also good to know, just studying the life history of insects, that they can occupy different habitats depending on the life stage that they're in. So for example, when we think about butterflies, usually we're thinking about the one that flits through flower to flower, right? But you can't have the butterflies without having the caterpillars. So keep that in mind. If you want to have a butterfly garden, please provide food for the caterpillars. Flies are another one that can occupy different spaces. So as juveniles, they need an aquatic environment, and as adults, they're going to be flying. A baby fly is not a little fly, it's a maggot. And then also just we don't always know where insects are nesting. So it's still a mystery, especially when you have ground nesters. That is a field that we're trying to learn about, but it's really hard to study things in the ground. Another reason why is kind of why these cicadas that are about to emerge, we still have so much that we need to learn about. It's still mysterious because they nest in the ground, and that's a really hard place for researchers to study. We do need more research on all of these. Some adaptations and coevolutions. So like I mentioned, bees have this very furry body, and those bifurcated hairs and pollen baskets, they are built for pollination. Many of the other pollinators, all of the butterflies and moths and beetles and those, they visit flowers and they can get pollen on them, and then they go to another flower, and so pollination can happen. Bees are built for it. Another interesting thing about bees is often they will pinpoint a patch of flowers of the same species, and they will work all of those. So they actually will be true to flower type. So that's another reason why they are just powerhouses when we look at the efficiency and effectiveness of pollinators. Whereas those butterflies, they can go from different species to different species, but the bees stick with they're true to the flower type. So more on morphology, some pollinators will have structures on them that are specific to flowers. So bees, there's some with a long tongue and others with a short tongue, and that can influence which type of flower they're going to go visit. And then there's some other bees that they don't even go into the flower, they just bite through the side of it and rob the nectar anyway. Many plants have developed unique shapes, unique colors, and then things that we can't see. We can look at a flower and we can think that it looks very beautiful, but when a bee looks at a flower, it's going to look very differently, and because they see a different light spectrum than we do. As I mentioned, there are behavioral adaptations and coevolutions that insects have with certain flowers. For example, the bumblebees and the buzz pollination. You know, I'm just going to throw this out there. When I have bumblebees here, it's 2 words. I'm going to make you all entomology nerds here, okay? So any of the Microsoft products, they try and make it 1 word. This is not a misspelling because as entomologists, they are true bees, and so it gets its own word, okay? It's the same with like flies. They get their own word if they're a fly, whereas dragonflies, that's 1 word because they're not true flies. Anyway, so just so y'all know. Okay. There are also physiological adaptations. We have generalist insects that will visit pretty much any flower. And then there's our specialists like squash bees that only visit squash plants, and they really do a good job. They're very efficient pollinators with those. All right, let's talk about some of the threats to our native pollinators. So a couple years ago, and we see every once in a while we see a cycle with more papers that come out that talk about the decline of insects. So these are some that came out a couple years ago. Insect populations are plummeting, and why it matters. The insect apocalypse is here. Insects are dying en masse, risking catastrophic collapse of Earth's ecosystems. Are these just hype? Is this just there to get you to look at this? I mean, it works. I mean, you're looking at it, but it turns out it's not hype. We actually are experiencing a massive decline in insects. And for a lot of people, they're like, yes, yay. But please remember all of those benefits that I told you about, that 98% of the insects, we need them. They are helping with our ecosystem. They are making it so that we actually are more comfortable, that we have food to eat. There was this paper that came out. It reviewed the literature just to see, is it really hype or is this real? And they found this is legit. Over 40% of insect species are threatened, not just with decline, but with extinction. Lepidoptera, so those are our butterflies and moths, Hymenoptera, which are our bees, ants, and wasps, and dung beetles, which are in the order Coleoptera. These are the taxa that are most affected. If you remember, those are where most of our pollinators are. What's happening to our insects? Well, habitat loss by conversion to intensive agriculture, agrochemical pollutants, invasive species, and climate change are what they found were driving this decline. So again, some more reasons why why is this important? 90% of the world's flowering plants depend on pollinators. 1 in 3 bites of food we eat is courtesy of insect pollinators. And as I've mentioned, many pollinators are important food sources for wildlife, including birds. So again, just a plug to go and look at the exhibit. Looking specifically at bees, 75% use bee pollinators. 1 in 4 of the bites are actually courtesy of bees. It's $15 billion of increased crop value comes from our bees. Here's some more examples of this decline. 28% of bumblebee species are in decline. 19% of butterflies in the US are at risk of extinction. 50% of leafcutter bees, 27% of mason bees are at risk. These are very big numbers. Our monarch population, maybe you've seen these statistics. And it kind of looks like when we look at the count that it was actually coming back up, and we were cheering for that. But then last year was the second worst year ever when they did counts. That should get our attention. Okay, so just a little bit of more information about this habitat loss and those drivers of decline. So habitat loss, most of us live in cities now. I think the recent statistic I heard was over 80% of the US population is in urban areas now. That's great. We can do a lot of things. But when we all used to live in rural areas and we had our own little family farms and we had things in bloom all the time, there were things for the insects to eat. Maybe the gardeners didn't appreciate it then, but there was a lot, there were things in bloom all the time, different things in bloom, just like we need to eat from the rainbow. Insects, most generalist insects need to eat from different plants in order to have, to meet their nutritional needs. So when all of us are in an urban area, we need to have big agriculture. We need to have these farms that are able to provide for our physical needs. But it does create a challenge for our insects. So now we have these massive farms that produce a lot of food, but usually it's a monocrop, and they might have things in bloom for about a 2-week period. And it's all the same. And so now our insects are having to fly further for a lower quality diet. Something to consider. Maybe there are things that we can do in these areas to create more more food for bees during those off times when when the actual crop isn't in bloom. Pesticides, for obvious reasons, they kill bugs, right? So we actually need, I'm not advocating the complete not use of pesticides. And initially, when we learned about pesticides and how to use them with the invention of pesticides, it was a boon for agriculture because killing off crop pests allowed for greater yield and efficiency. However, one more. Sorry, there we go. However, many of these pesticides are general pesticides. They can kill not just a target organism, but they can kill many different organisms. And so we need to actually do more research to find out how to be more careful. And this picture is not just about agriculture. It's about those of us who live in urban areas. Because while a farmer has to, use them, they are very judicious in how they do it because they also understand the importance of having our beneficial insects, our predatory insects in their fields. And so they do need to be careful. It also costs a lot. Whereas those of us in urban areas, more is better, right? And that's actually not true. And if we're not careful of what we're actually putting into our yards, we can actually in urban areas do more harm than good. All right, and then there's also climate change or weather extremes that are happening. These also can affect our insect populations. So fires can destroy habitat. Our droughts can destroy habitat that like our ground nesting insects have. The weather extremes with late frosts or early severe frosts, those can affect when plants are in bloom. And then there's parasites and diseases. So this is a honeybee, and you can hopefully see that massive mite on it. If that were me, that mite approximately would be about a dinner-sized plate, things sucking fluids from me. Not great. I would not want that. It's not healthy for the bees, and these actually vector diseases as well. So some people might consider a honeybee an invasive species. I personally don't. They are not native here, but they do provide a valuable service. But that mite would be considered a invasive species. So it's a varroa mite. And honeybees are not just dealing with varroa mites, but there's tracheal mites and there's small hive beetle and there's waxworm and there's a lot of things that they're dealing with, and all of that contributes to that decline. How does that affect our native bees? Because varroa mites are a specialist on honeybees, but it turns out that some of the diseases that they can have actually the virus can actually be left on flowers if a bee visits the flower. So it actually can impact our native bees. But I have to say, there's a lot we just don't know because we're not studying the native bees. We need to have more research with our native bees to find out how they're being impacted by the many things that are going on in the world. I'm adding a few more things to that list of things that cause decline. So pollution. Don't get me started on microplastics, but there's so much out there. There was a paper that was recently published just about the pollution that's out there that can actually change the way insects can smell. So how they're actually able to interact with plants if they can't smell them if there's pollution. We need to take that into consideration. A lot of us like to be out in our yard and mowing can be therapeutic, but maybe there's things that we can do to create a better environment. Our mowers, our leaf blowers actually give off more pollution than what our vehicles give off because the vehicles are more tightly regulated. So maybe if you have an opportunity, change to electric, and they're quieter, so it's less noise pollution, and they give off less pollution for our insects. Light pollution. We live in a day and age now where it is very light, even in the middle of the night, and this also impacts our insects. Recent research has validated this, that that it can disrupt the mating of insects. It can disrupt the feeding of insects. And a study just came out about our moths and how they are possibly more efficient pollinators than the daytime insects. But we didn't study them because they're at night and we're sleeping. So anyway, there's so much that we need to learn about, so much more to learn, which is exciting. Anyway, I've kind of portrayed this very sad story, and I think it's really important to let you guys know some of the things that our insects are dealing with, because when we know what they're dealing with, then we are able to find solutions to make things better. So E.O. Wilson, a well-respected sociobiologist, said this: if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. Think about that for a minute. So now we're going to talk about some conservation initiatives. There are many things that we actually can do, things that we can do starting today. When you leave here, there are things that you can do, and I want to help you be empowered by this. First of all, I think it's really important to learn about learning. There are many programs that we can be involved in to learn more. These are just some, like the top two: the Extension Master Gardener Program, the Master Naturalist Program. Most states have those kinds of programs. Bumblebee Watch is a national program, and it's actually getting started, I think, fairly soon. The Dunn Prairie Ranch seed effort here in the Kansas City area, where they're actually collecting native seeds to be able to be distributed elsewhere. Homegrown National Park, anybody hear about that? Yeah, so it's a way for us to look at the properties that we have and how can we make that give back to the system instead of taking away? Can we leave areas of our yard to make it so it's a better habitat for our native insects? And then I have Leave the Leaves. There's also No Mow May or No Mow April. There's lots of different things that we can do to help. And so let's talk about some of these specifically. First of all, we can create better habitat. So we can participate in community programs and efforts. We can plant more flowers, create nesting sites, keep it dark at night, and use IPM strategies. I'm going to dive into these too. All right, so planting more flowers. Consider native species. Why? Some people, when I have this first conversation with them, they're like, but those are weeds. No, I mean, maybe some, but there are so many amazing plants that we can put out there that are absolutely beautiful, and they actually give back to the environment rather than taking away. Also, when you're thinking of planting flowers, consider flowers that are in bloom throughout the season. So early spring, mid-spring, late spring, early summer, late summer, early fall, late fall, so that there's actually food for the insects to eat. Include different heights, so short and tall. Don't forget trees. So right now outside, you can see the red buds in bloom. Oh my goodness, they're so beautiful. Serviceberry is another one. Some of these, when you think about a tree in bloom, and how many floral resources are we having right there in an area? Just, it's beautiful for us and it's beneficial for the insects. Also, please avoid invasive species. Calorie pears, don't plant those. They're still for sale, but they're actually an invasive species. MDC, Missouri Department of Conservation, has a list of plants of concern and those that are considered invasive. Please do check that out so that you have, if you're going to replace a plant or put one in the ground, you have an opportunity to, again, give back to the environment rather than take away. The next few slides actually are showing you different resources that are out there to help you find some native plants. And to show you, I'm going to show off some plants to show they are beautiful. You will not be any less of a gardener. You'll be a better gardener, I think, if you're thinking about it this way. So Grow Native has a bunch of top 10 lists that you can check out for many different situations, but don't just look at Grow Native. We have great resources like Deep Roots KC here in Kansas City that have a lot of resources. Deep Roots KC also has some example garden plans that you might want to check out. So this one, outstanding native plants for pollinators. Now, these lists are not in any particular order, and these are not the only 10 plants that you can plant to help pollinators, just some examples and places to get you started. This is aromatic aster. It's one of my favorite. It blooms in the late fall and just provides that pop of color that I really enjoy, but I see that it gets visited a lot by bees. You do have to plant it in the right place though, because it can be a little bit aggressive. And so as with everything when I'm teaching about horticulture, right plant, right place, make sure you take that into consideration. Here's some top performing native plants just generally, but this one right here, the American beautyberry, another beautiful flower with a beautiful berry that can actually be very ornamental for us, but it's also helpful for our pollinators. Here's another one. It's really small, but if you just type in a grow native top 10 list and look for plants for full sun, you'll get this list. So this is one of my favorite. This is Baptistia, just an elegant plant with these beautiful flowers on it. Something you would definitely want to have in your yard. They have plants for every situation. That last one's full sun. We also have plants for part shade. And then we have plants that are available in full shade. Now, this one might not be for pollinators, but it's still a beautiful plant. You don't just have to plant flowers. I like planting foliage as well. And this one is especially important for those of us here in Missouri. Clay soils. There's still a lot of plants that we can grow that will thrive in clay soils and still be beautiful and benefit the environment. All right, so we talked about planting flowers. I want you guys, if anything you take away from this, plant more flowers, okay? And if you think you have enough, I'm sure you can find places to plant more. And there's plant sales coming up. Our Extension Master Gardeners have one coming up in about a month too. So look for those plant sales. Plant for year-round blooms, plant blooms day and night, just plant flowers. Oh, and I should also point out, another reason native plants can be really helpful is if you look at this, a lot of our plants have, our cultivated plants, they will have double petals or triple petals, but a lot of our insects really need to have these single layer of petals. Otherwise, it can hinder their ability to actually get in. And there's questions about whether or not it can actually decrease, like the double petals can actually decrease the amount of pollen or nectar that they produce. Also consider making your lawns pollinator friendly. So I still have a lawn because I have kids and pets that need to have that space, but I've gone ahead and actually put in clover. Not necessarily native species, but it's more flowers. Another thing that I do is I don't worry about lawn flowers. Notice I called it flowers instead of weeds because a weed is a flower out of place. To me, it's a flower. And so I have extra lawn flowers. In the horticulture world, we talk a lot about putting mulch out. So if you are a hardcore gardener, I'm sure you have mulch everywhere, but maybe leave some areas that don't have mulch because a lot of our bees, being ground nesters, they actually need some bare ground in order to nest. I am now giving you permission to be a lazy gardener. In the fall, instead of cleaning everything up, if you can, leave the stems there. Because remember, if they're not ground nesters, they can be cavity nesters. And so they need those resources. If you do have to cut them, scientists used to say that you could cut them and lay them to the side, but it turns out that that orientation of being up is actually really important. So if you do have to cut them, leave them to the side, but standing up. Bee hotels, they're cute. They have the potential to be good, but they actually can do more harm than good if you're not very intentional about it. Think about it. We're bringing all of these bees that we're trying to help into one enclosed space all together, and that is a perfect place for now the diseases and their pests to come as well. So the best thing to do would actually to be create more flowers or more habitats. So again, plant more flowers. But if you do have a bee hotel, make sure that every single year you are cleaning it out, you are sanitizing it, you're putting new materials in it, and that will actually be more helpful than not. Maybe you've heard of the Leave the Leaf campaign. Again, I'm giving you an excuse to be a bit of a lazy gardener. Leave the leaves. A lot of insects actually use the leaves as their habitat to overwinter. So they might be attached to the leaves, or they might be using the leaves as insulation to help reduce that fluctuation in temperatures that we get throughout the winter. So where it can be 80 degrees and then 30 degrees, all in a 24-hour period, having those leaves actually insulate it so it doesn't happen so fast, and we have more positive outcomes with insects. Oh, and I will just say this. If you don't have enough room for all of the leaves that fall in your yard, and I do rake them out of my lawn because I don't want them to kill the lawn. But if you run out of room, consider getting rid of some of your lawn so you have more room for the leaves. All right, keeping it dark at night. As I mentioned earlier, all of this artificial light does actually impact our insects. So if you can, turn off the lights and make it so that the light from your house, inside your house, doesn't go out. So you can close your curtains. It really does impact them. It can affect the way that they hunt. It can affect if they're even able to mate. It can make them more vulnerable to predators. It really can negatively affect their outcomes. Some examples: fireflies, they rely on bioluminescent cues to find mates, but if there's a lot of light, they're not going to be able to see them. And I love fireflies. Some insects like mayflies, they actually use polarized light to be able to find bodies of water for breeding. And so if they can't see because there's too much light, they're not going to be able to do that. So the best solution is turn off the lights. If you can't do that, because we do live in a society where safety can be a concern, there are some other things you can do. Maybe have a motion sensor. Maybe instead of having a light that just broadcasts light, have blinders on it, basically, so it doesn't go, the light doesn't go everywhere, but it's in a focused area. Some lights are more attractive to insects than others. So amber lights would be the better ones, so it doesn't attract or disrupt insects. But all of these still let light be out there. So if you can, turn off your lights. Then IPM, Integrated Pest Management. So integrated pest management, that is a science-based approach that combines a variety of techniques. I'm reading this up here, and this link is a link to this infographic is on that handout in the back. But it's a science-based approach that combines a variety of techniques by studying their life cycles and how pests interact with the environment. IPM professionals can manage pests with the most current methods to improve management, lower costs, and reduce risks to people and the environment. Kind of sounds perfect, right? And it really is. It's as good as what it sounds. I mean, there are things that we have to do, but to make it so that we've created a better world, but we still are able to have our crops that work and our ornamentals that can be healthy, we really need to take these steps. So if we have a garden, please get in it. Please walk around it at least once a week, but I would love for all of you to be out in your garden every day. And when you're out there enjoying it, take a moment to flip over the leaves so that you can see what insects are there, if there are any diseases. When we are monitoring our crops and our gardens, we're able to catch problems before they become big problems. Then if you do find an insect, a lot of people, when they find out I'm an entomologist, it's like, what is it? Great question. Ask that question. Extension is here to help. The next question is often, how do I kill it? I'm like, stop right there. Most insects are beneficial. So if it's a beneficial insect, we're not going to kill it, right? So if it's a pollinator, if it's a beneficial predatory, if it's a neutral insect, we don't need to kill it. If it is a pest, then we look at that next one. Evaluate. Is it actually causing damage? Is it actually in a life stage where it can cause damage? Is it in the stage where to the plant, it's actually going to cause damage? There are a lot of things that we can evaluate, and we can look at threshold levels to see if we actually need to take steps. Because if we go to the time and effort to eliminate them, but it's after the damage has been caused, it's not going to help. It's a waste of money for us, and it actually is putting things into the environment that don't need to be there. So evaluate. There are things that we can do to prevent problems to begin with. We can, like in a vegetable garden, we can plant crops that are resistant to both diseases or to certain insects. We can rotate our crops so we reduce a disease load. We can keep sanitation good in the garden to reduce problems. So there's a lot of things that we can do to prevent problems from even happening. But let's say we were out there, we found an insect that actually can cause problems. The threshold is there that it indicates some action is necessary. What do we do? Do we go straight for the nuclear option and grab the most toxic thing we have? So because it's a bug and we want to get rid of it? I'm going to say, please don't. We're going to use the least toxic method that gives us effective results. Again, the least toxic method that gives us effective results. And in home gardens, often what that is a cup of soapy water that we are just knocking the insects into. Okay. But then there are other options that we could use. We could be using a dormant oil, a horticulture soap, a horticulture oil. There's a lot of things that are there. There's neem oil. There are a lot of things that we can use before we grab one of those really harsh chemicals that will kill both the good insects with the bad insects. And we'll have residuals and that can cause other problems. Also, if you do find that you have to spray something, please don't do it while your plants are in bloom because that's bringing insects there. If you need to spray something, remove the blooms in order to make it less impactful on our beneficials. So there we go. Here are some key points. I do have a QR code because I'm extension and I have to be evaluated on like everything. So if you guys have a phone, feel free to scan that. I also put a code in there if you don't use a QR code. But I would appreciate it if you could let me know. It's just a couple questions, but the key points, again, native pollinators, while enigmatic, they are essential organisms in our ecosystem. That's both our natural systems as well as our food systems. We need more research. There's so much we don't know. And so if you have an opportunity to advocate for science, advocate for research, please do. Our native pollinator populations are threatened. Again, that's due to habitat loss, to pesticide use, to climate change, diseases, and artificial light. There are things that we can do, but there's also things that we can advocate for. And like I said, we can assist in that, in the conservation efforts. And that's planting more flowers, as well as all the others, but plant more flowers. And this is the time to do that. Again, learn more. You guys are here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for learning more. Please teach others things that you are learning. Again, plant more flowers, consider native plants, keep it dark at night, use integrated pest management. And we have time for questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr.
you.
Tamra. As she said, we do have time for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll come around with the microphone so those watching online can also hear.
My grandma's a master gardener.
Your grandma's a
That's
master gardener.
wonderful.
That's great. Hi. You all can be extension master gardeners, just so you know.
I have a question. Okay, I've been trying to go more native and plant flowers, but this year and last year I have amazing crop of dead nettle and the other thing that looks like it that's also purple.
Henbit.
Henbit, yeah. And everything says you have to leave that. But I can't, there's so much, I can't leave it all. So I guess is the best, but I do see bees coming to it. And I guess I don't care about them pollinating that, but they're just eating, right? I mean, they're just going there to get food.
Well, they are. And in that process, they're pollinating, which means there'll be more seeds. Yes.
Right. So great. Yay. So ideally pull some and leave some. Is that what people would say when you have something like that? Because it's a takeover really of the whole.
You bring up a really good point of what is enough.
Yeah.
And I realize when I am presenting this, I'm presenting like this ideal of all the angles, but we all live in our environment and we have to figure out what works out best for us. And it's really good. This all comes back to learning more, learning what is the threshold that works for you, and learning about the different organisms. So henbit, and oh goodness, I just forgot the
Dead
other one.
nettle.
Dead nettle, thank you. Those actually, like, if you needed to control those, there are things that you can do in the fall, actually, to make it so that you don't have as many in the spring. So like you said, the more you have, the more you will continue to get. And so you do have to find a balance where you are okay. And that could be different between you and your neighbors. It can be different in different neighborhoods with what the HOA allows and what people want or what city regulations. You do have to take all of those things into consideration, so that you are able to continue to do what you want to do in your environment.
All right, Dr. Tamara, we got a question back here.
Thanks so much. The native bees, I have lots of them in my yard and they're very, very active right now because we have so many flowers blooming. I am in my garden all the time. Are there things that I do that could cause them to come after me or sting me? Because I've just been ignoring them. What should I do?
Have they come after you to sting you?
They have not.
Okay, sounds like you're doing well. So I think this is really a great point though, because people get so nervous about the bees. Anybody here like to be stung? No. Okay. I don't like to be stung either, but it is really good to know that for bees, they're just trying to do their job. And sometimes we do get stung if we're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and we might get between them and where they're trying to go. Most of our native bees are absolutely not aggressive. So as long as you just let them do their thing, they're going to do their thing. What usually happens there are some social wasps that can be more aggressive, and a lot of people just lump them into the same category and think they're all bees. Even our wasps are extremely beneficial in our gardens. They are eating caterpillars. They are our friends. They can be a human health risk. And as an urban entomologist, I recommend that, if there's a hive that's close to your house, attached to your house, please go ahead and get that treated. I want you to be safe. But even if it's a wasp nest that's further out that you're not really coming across, please don't be a wasp ninja to try and destroy them. They are very beneficial to our environment.
All right, we got a question over here.
One comment would be, I've always gone by the motto that a weed is just a misplaced plant. And in the right place in your yard, they look great. So I have some neighbors around in my neighborhood that are using Mosquito Joe. And not that I like mosquitoes much, but I wonder, do you know anything about what the heck they're spraying all over the place? Because they don't care whether it's a windy day and it's coming into your yard. So I'd like to hear about Mosquito Joe.
Yeah, oh boy, you are putting me on the spot. No, this is a real concern, because mosquitoes are a human health risk. They do vector diseases, so we do need to be careful about that. One of the best ways actually to get rid of mosquitoes is to not provide them habitat in your yard. They're not strong flyers. They usually, when you see mosquitoes, they're not coming too far from where they emerged. But most people don't know that. They just think they're mosquitoes and they don't want to be bit. So what is being sprayed often is something it doesn't just kill the mosquitoes. I'm not giving you probably the answer exactly that you want, but I'm PSA right here. Having these generalist mosquito pesticides put out there, they're often killing our beneficials as well. And our mosquitoes, whereas they will recycle those that didn't get killed, will have more mosquitoes in a week's time. Our beneficial insects often take an entire year to develop. And so we lose our beneficial insects when people just spray some generalist pesticide out there. So that is not a good thing. I wish that I could work with the industry to help them understand that. But I think the best thing we'll do is to talk with people like you so that you understand that. There are things that can be put in water. There's some pellets that actually use a fungus that kills just the mosquitoes, and that actually works. It's much more effective. Also, anytime we have a rain event, please go out there and dump any water that you have so that there aren't places for mosquitoes to breed.
Okay, we've got a question up near the front.
Well, actually, I was going to talk about the mosquitoes and that you can put, well, if you want to if you have a place with water, a bucket with water, and you put those pellets in, it's much more effective than when they spray. When they spray, that actually is not very effective. So it's cheaper, it's easier, and it's targets the larva. I think it's a larva that it's actually targeting when you do that.
Yeah, mosquito dunks, I believe are what they're called.
Plug for the homegrown national park movement, which is this movement. It's started by an entomologist who's trying to get people to map when they try encouraging native planting, but he's trying to get people to map. And all you have to do is go out to the homegrown national park site. There's some great videos out there about the need for it, but he also will, it doesn't cost you anything. You can buy a sign for $20 if you want to, so you can talk to your neighbors about it, but you don't have to do anything. But they're trying to get people mapping and getting the idea out there. We don't have enough public national parks land to save our pollinators. It's got to be done on private land. So it's kind of a way to monitor that and to encourage that. So
Thank you. It's so true. Do it. That's your homework with planting more flowers. But
Well, thank you. So I have a question about our native bees, kind of a two-part question. First is, so especially with the generalists, or sorry, the specialists, so they're essentially the ground nesters, the mining bees, for example, they're kind of timed to emerge at the same time that flowers are blooming. So are they following similar cues, like with soil temperature, humidity, things like that? But also, I'm wondering if there's research being done about maybe some phenological mismatches between the flowers and the bees, whether it be long-term climate change trends or just like an off year. Like I know we've had a really strong El Nino this year and just seems like everything's been blooming earlier. I have been checking our red buds and willows, also looking at dandelions. Of course, they're everywhere. And there are bees out there, of course, pollinating them, but is there any research being done on mismatches between bloom times?
so we have another hour to talk, right? There is some research, and we are finding that there is a mismatch with things that are blooming earlier or later, because plants might have different cues that cause them to bloom than what the insects have for when they emerge. So we're learning that there is a mismatch that can happen, and it can cause problems. Let's see, that was the second part of your question. What was your first part? Oh, the same cues. Right. So for some insects, having that temperature cue is really important. For example, the periodical cicadas, 8 inches down when it hits about 64.5 degrees, that's when we start to see the cicadas emerge. But yeah, that can happen with some insects that they can be temperature dependent. It also can be light dependent. So as the days get longer, with additional light, that is what a cue is for many of our insects.
Okay, question over here.
Yeah, hi, thank you. You talked about food for particularly butterflies. I know about parsley and rue for certain ones. What are some other examples to plant? Because I do tons of flowers, but I need to do the other part.
Yeah, so I'm gonna recommend that you get online and start looking some of that up. But yeah, there are some insects that are specific to like parsley. Like there's a swallowtail. Eric, you should keep me up on this. Okay, if you don't know Eric Eaton, he's keeping me honest up here. But yeah, look it up to find out what plants are specific. Like I have pawpaws in my yard, which are a host for zebra butterflies. Yeah, and there's certain vines that are going to be specific for other butterflies. So just look it up online. I don't have that in my head or online, so you're putting me on the spot. You guys are doing that.
All right, we got one
Oh,
way back over here.
Okay.
Okay, back to mosquitoes for a second. It seems like I read there is a native plant, not in this region, that is only pollinated by a mosquito, a specific mosquito. Is that correct? Do you know?
I do not know
thought it
enough
was up
about
in
this to be able
Minnesota.
to talk about it.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I do have a second question mentioning kind of climate change, planting areas. We're in zone 6 now pretty firmly, I think.
6B.
Yeah. So is there reason to start perhaps planting things that are 6, 7 zone as insects move further north with warming? Should we be planning ahead more in that regard, especially with trees and all? Or is it?
So that's a tricky question. We do need to be thinking that way. I'm hesitant to plant things in a warmer zone because we still have some of those really cold snaps. So if I am going to plant anything that is going to be sentimental or is expensive, I'm going to plant things that are usually like zone 4 or 5 that can handle any weird snap that we have. But I do experiment with other things. I just planted a banana tree in my yard last year. It's one that can handle supposedly zone 5, but I'll tell you what, it has not even started to come up this year, so it may not have made it through the winter. That's the risk that we take when we experiment.
All right, and we've come up on the hour, so I'm going to make this live stream virtual question our final one. This viewer rents a home with a yard and they want to add native plants but need to stay renter friendly. Any advice for utilizing their space to help native pollinators?
Great question. Everyone can plant more flowers. All of us can do something, whether that is a container garden, that's what I would recommend, especially if you're in a renter situation. You can do a lot with containers. So there are big containers, there are little containers, you can use a yogurt cup. But there's also some really cool felt garden raised beds that you can start using that I've seen used very successfully, and that you can just pick them up and go when it's time to go. So yes, plant more flowers. In containers, in the ground, anywhere, just plant more flowers.
Love that. Thank you so much, Dr. Tamra.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.